failure. And the word heard, I heard exactly what you said.
I will tell you how I use the word failure, because I use the word failure to their leaders. You, sir, are the failure. You don't have a strategy. You don't have a long-term plan to actually win this war. Standing what it takes to actually win.
Political cowardice of Democrats who won't fund the troops.
More American troops are dead. The cost of a war with Iran continues to rise. Yet Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is back before Congress asking for billions more in military funding. As pressure mounts over the Trump administration strategy, Senator Gary Peters accused Hegseth of failing America's troops, not on the battlefield, but through failed leadership. What followed was one of the Senate Appropriations Committee hearings' most explosive confrontations, as the two clashed over accountability, strategy, and whether the war is any closer to ending.
Secretary Hegseth, over the course of the war with Iran, I have repeatedly expressed concerns regarding the administration's lack of a winning strategy and repeated contradictions about the state of the war. Frankly, it doesn't help that you and your president continues to mislead the American people. You and the president have repeatedly said that the war, as we've heard over and over again, is almost over or already won. In fact, the president alone has said the war is almost over more than 30 times. On March 1st, the president said, we'll be done in 4 or 5 weeks. On March 9th, he said the war was very complete. On April 8th, he declared total and complete victory, 100%, no question about it. On the same day, you declared Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory on the battlefield, a capital V military victory by any measure. And yet today, July 21st, we have soldiers whose remains are sadly going to be returned to their deeply grieving families tomorrow. Clearly, the war is not over yet. After months of conflict, our strategy to win remains unclear. I have long said the United States has the strongest military in history in the world, and I have no doubt that our brave service members can execute any mission and prevail in any battle. But without a clear winning strategy, we're at risk of being in another forever war that'll put our service members in continued harm's way and continue to cost taxpayers billions of dollars. Secretary Hegseth, despite your failure to win this war, you are back now before Congress asking for almost $70 billion in additional funding. You're asking the American people for a blank check because, once again, the Trump administration's efforts have been an utter and complete failure to win this war to this point. So my question for you, sir, is how is your strategy different than what we've seen in the past? So far, we have not seen a strategy that's been successful. You mentioned nuclear material is the primary goal of the war. It still exists. We haven't dealt with that issue yet. You talk about the destruction of missiles, and yet the missiles that we saw hit recent targets are actually somehow more lethal, more deadly, more maneuverable than what we have seen in the past. So they're obviously improving their munitions. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed, reminding everybody it was open before the war. Prices were lower for everybody until the war, and it still remains closed. And of course, tragically, people, service members, our warfighters, who we care deeply about, are still dying. So what's different?
Just 2 days later, the House voted to require congressional approval for continued military operations against Iran, while the Senate rejected a similar effort. That vote showed Congress remained deeply divided over the war strategy and how long it should continue. Now watch how this hearing shifts from military policy to a direct clash over leadership.
Mr. Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth.
I think your characterization of this incredible effort as a failure is reckless. And I think it's irresponsible. And I think it smears the sacrifice of the troops that are out there making on behalf of the American people to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Shame on you and others who call this a quagmire and a failure, and then you want to turn around and say you support the warfighter. Either you do or you don't.
Is the nuclear material still there,
I can get you a ticket out to CENTCOM and talk to what those Americans are doing and how committed they are to this effort and how they want to ensure that Iran never threatens their families with a nuclear weapon. That's the kind of intensity that our warfighters have about making sure that Iran isn't capable of doing that.
Secretary Hegseth, if you listen to my comments, you would have heard me say how amazing our warfighters are.
I heard failure. And the word heard, I heard exactly what you said.
I will tell you how I use the word failure, because I use the word failure to their leaders. You, sir, are the failure. not the men and women who are on that front line, not the men and women who hold up their honor with distinction. But if there's a lack of a winning strategy, they're in harm's way. Their leaders have failed them. And that's what's happening. We have political leadership. You don't have a strategy. You don't have a long-term plan to actually win this war. Win the war. The men and women are going to be able to do it, but they need to have leadership. When will you show leadership? When will you show leadership?
Why don't you show some leadership and stand up to your fellow Democrats who won't fund the troops, who stand and play partisan politics while you don't give us the money? You want to stand up here and talk about the troops? You won't show any political courage to actually fund our department because you have Trump derangement syndrome and can't actually commit to anything meaningful. So I put this on you, Senator.
Secretary Hegseth, you have trillions, you have over $1 trillion. You're asking for $1.5 trillion. It's not a question of money. It's a question of leadership and understanding what it takes to actually win.
Political cowardice of Democrats who won't fund the troops.
Senators.
Following the July 21st, 2026 Senate Appropriations Committee hearing, congressional scrutiny of Iran conflict intensified as lawmakers debated not only the cost of the war, but also whether the administration had presented Congress with a realistic strategy for achieving its stated objectives. Just 2 days later, on July 23, 2026, the House of Representatives narrowly passed a resolution urging President Trump to seek congressional authorization before continuing military operations against Iran. Although the Senate rejected a similar measure later that same day, the competing votes demonstrated that concerns over presidential war powers, military strategy, and congressional oversight remained unresolved. The financial and human costs also became increasingly difficult to ignore. During this very hearing, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth estimated that the Iran war had already cost approximately $37.5 billion and requested tens of billions of dollars in additional funding. The hearing came only days after the Pentagon confirmed additional American service member casualties, further intensifying questions about how long the conflict might continue and what success would ultimately look like. Against that backdrop, Senator Gary Peters built his questioning around one central argument, that America's military strength alone is not enough without a clearly defined strategy. Before asking about funding or military capabilities, Peters acknowledged the sacrifice of American service members and expressed sympathy for the families affected by the recent casualties. That opening established the tone for the remainder of the exchange, separating criticism of military leadership from criticism of the troops serving in combat. Peters then challenged repeated public statements made by both President Trump and Secretary Hegseth, suggesting that the conflict was nearing victory. By citing multiple public remarks declaring that the war was nearly finished, he argued that those optimistic assessments conflicted with the reality of continuing casualties, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, rising energy costs, and the administration's request for additional military funding. Rather than accepting that characterization, Secretary Hegseth forcefully defended both the administration and the military campaign. He rejected the description of the operation as a failure and argued that the objective remained preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Throughout the exchange, he maintained that American service members were carrying out their mission with professionalism and courage, and suggested that describing the campaign as a failure undermined their sacrifices. The most intense moment came when Peters drew a distinction between the performance of U.S. troops and the decisions made by civilian leadership. He made clear that his criticism was directed not at the men and women serving on the front lines, but at what he viewed as an absence of a long-term strategy. Hegseth responded by turning the criticism back toward congressional Democrats, arguing that lawmakers who questioned the administration's funding requests were failing to support the military during an active conflict. That exchange captured the broader disagreement shaping debate in Washington throughout 2026. One side argued that continued funding without a clearly defined strategy risked extending another costly conflict with uncertain objectives. The other maintained that withholding resources during wartime would weaken American forces and embolden adversaries. The disagreement was therefore not simply about military spending, but about how Congress should exercise oversight while U.S. troops remained engaged in combat. It is also important to distinguish verified developments from political rhetoric. The hearing included competing claims regarding the effectiveness of the military campaign, the likelihood of victory, the administration strategy, and the causes of rising economic costs. Those issues remain matters of political debate, while facts such as congressional votes, funding requests, casualty reports, and official Pentagon statements can be independently verified. Oversight hearings frequently combine factual questioning with strongly worded political arguments, making that distinction especially important. Looking back, this hearing became significant because it highlighted two competing visions of leadership during wartime. One emphasized sustaining military operations until strategic objectives were achieved, while the other insisted that continued military engagement required a clearer plan, greater transparency, and stronger congressional oversight. As the conflict continued beyond this hearing, those questions remained central to the national debate over America's role in the Middle East. What do you think? Was Senator Gary Peters right to question whether the administration had a clear strategy for ending the conflict, or did Secretary Pete Hegseth make the stronger case that continued military pressure was necessary despite the costs? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below.